Army, Navy, and Air Force, all been expanded, and a lot of capacity building has taken place. This has yielded impressive results since the end of the war. The latest example, which took place at the beginning of this month, was the arrest of an LTT intelligence cadre named Sri Skandaraja. This cadre had fled the country during the last stages of the conflict, but had to return to Sri Lanka illegally recently and was active in Trincomalee. This arrest and others like it have been made possible only because of the maintenance of the constant vigilance by the intelligence services. This vigilance is in turn supported by the presence of military camps at strategic locations in the north and east. Although the military has been recognized from a war, reorganized from a war footing to a peacetime role, the number of troops deployed in the north and east reduced, and its involvement in maintenance of law enforcement activities stopped. Its continued presence in these areas remains essential. This is first and foremost part of the normalization process that was necessary after the end of the terrorist conflict. The government has always maintained military camps in strategic areas which are of critical importance to the preservation of national security. In this context, it is extremely unfortunate to note that certain ethnocentric political parties continue to demand the removal of military camps from the north and east. These parties are mostly funded by pro-separatist elements, so it is no surprise that their aims remain similar to those of the LTT, even though they show a democratic face to the world. What is much more disturbing is that certain influential political figures in the democratic mainstream have supported this demand to remove military camps from the north and east. This is an extremely dangerous and irresponsible action that could seriously undermine our national security and threaten our future prospects. Removing the military due to pressure from parties with hidden agendas could very well undo the immense progress that has been achieved in Sri Lanka over the past 9 years. Despite the immense pressure being brought to bear by these political forces, some NGOs, and even certain foreign powers with vested interest, the incumbent government will take all measures necessary to preserve national security. The fact that peace and stability remain firmly in place 5 years after the end of the conflict is to a large degree because of such measures taken by the Ministry of Defense and its agencies. The fact that no incidents of large-scale violence have broken out after the war does not mean that such threats do not exist. It merely means that these threats have so far been very effectively dealt with. For example, there have been several attempts by the LTT remnants over the past 2 years to reorganize and carry out terrorist activity in the country. In March 2012, a member of the EPDP was killed in Trincomalee by a group of LTT cadres. These cadres had returned to Sri Lanka illegally via boats from Tamil Nadu, where they had fled during the last stages of the humanitarian operation. In December 2012, intelligence and law enforcement agencies were able to arrest 2 youths who were returning to Sri Lanka from Chennai after undergoing training on how to make IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These youths revealed that there were many more LTT cadres in Chennai who were working towards the reorganization of the LTT and the resumption of violence in Sri Lanka. As a result of the information received, a combined operation was carried out with the Chennai police to arrest these cadres and dismantle this terrorist cell. Despite the success of that operation, it is evident that the LTT's operatives will continue to work towards resurrecting terrorism in Sri Lanka wherever and whenever they can. The most recent and visible instance of LTT activity resuming took place earlier this year. Intelligence agencies were able to uncover a covert LTT group run with support of the LTT's international network. More than, 40 suspects, including several cadres who had evaded capture during the conflict, were detained for investigations. Ammunitions for T-56 assault rifles, mortar shells, grenades, and 2.5 kg Claymore mine were also recovered. These weapons would most likely have been part of a cache hidden by the LTT during the conflict and recovered only recently. Most significantly, the arrest led to a lead on the whereabouts of a person called K.P. Selvanayagam, alias Gopi. Must have read in papers. Gopi was a senior LTT cadre who had fled the country during the war, but had returned illegally earlier this year to restart LTT activities in Sri Lanka. He was killed in a shootout during a search operation in the Wanni region, in the jungles of Wanni, the 11th of April, along with 2 other senior cadres. One of these cadres was a member of the LTT Air Wing and was involved in the attacks on Anuradhapura Air Base and the Kolonnawa Petroleum Storage Base in 2007. What these incidents demonstrate beyond any doubt is that the threat of terrorist activities resuming in Sri Lanka remains a very real national security concern. It is therefore essential that all the measures taken by the government to counter these threats continue uninterrupted. Similarly, the possibility of interference in Sri Lanka's internal affairs by external forces remain a very real threat to our sovereignty. Although the government has successfully foiled all attempts to resume violence in Sri Lanka, the activities of the LTT network in the international arena still continues, as you know. Through heavy lobbying in foreign capitals, influencing high-profile figures in the international community and the media, and by carrying out concerted and skillful propaganda campaign, these groups have succeeded in internationalizing Sri Lanka's internal affairs over time. This is a process that took place over several decades. Many in the international community assumed that the LTT was just a ragtag group of fighters emerging from time to time from amidst the civilian population to carry out attacks. They did not fully understand that the LTT was a vast, sophisticated military force that at times outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overran the Sri Lankan military. Because of this misreading of the nature of the LTT threat, either through innocence or willful ignorance, and also as a result of certain geopolitical agendas, some influential foreign governments did not quite support the government's decision in 2006 to pursue a military solution to the terrorist conflict. Although several friendly countries had banned the LTT, not all of its activities in the international arena were stopped. For example, the LTT continued raising funds through various means and very successfully procured its weapons from overseas. Members of LTT-linked groups also built significant pressure on the government of Sri Lanka to stop the humanitarian operation. They intensively lobbied foreign governments, organized large public protest, and used their influence with the international media to make various allegations against the Sri Lankan military. His Excellency the President, Mahinda Rajapaksa, did not cave into this pressure, and the humanitarian operation continued until terrorism was defeated in Sri Lanka. However, in the years after this defeat, the same LTT-linked elements have redoubled their efforts in the global arena. Their new strategy is to claim to be human rights activists who are working to bring the Sri Lankan government and its military to justice for alleged crimes and human rights violations during the humanitarian operation. It is largely because of these efforts that despite the end of the conflict 5 years ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council continues to keep Sri Lanka high on its agenda. An investigation whose justification and legitimacy has been categorically rejected by the government is now being carried out through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This is in spite of all the efforts made by the government through official publications to demonstrate that the humanitarian operation was conducted in accordance with the international norms. This is despite conclusive evidence put forward to show that the mass killings did not take place. For example, a comprehensive professional census was carried out by the Department of Census and Statistics using Tamil-speaking enumerators from the north and east in 2011. This census has conclusively proven that the number of lives lost during the humanitarian operation, including those of LTT cadres, is a fraction of numbers that are being alleged abroad. The majority of the deaths, in fact, were of LTT cadres who died during the fighting. Despite all of these evidence to the contrary, the notion that the military acted against civilian interest is being given a lot of support at multilateral forums because of the work of certain LTT influential individuals and organizations. There is also credible evidence that a concerted campaign has been undertaken by the LTT and its sympathizers to fabricate evidence against Sri Lanka for use in the international investigations. If you can remember, the blank complaint forms signed by resettled civilians have been found in the possession of an ex-LTT cadre working in concert with a prominent ethnocentric political party. It is overwhelmingly likely that these forms were to be submitted to the international investigation after being filled out by third parties. Many more such blank signed forms no doubt exist. One can only assume what accusations will be found on these pre-signed blank forms once they are filled in and submitted to the international investigation. Yet, unfortunately, this is what is being claimed as credible evidence by these agencies. It is particularly disturbing to note that a spokesperson of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has even indicated that evidence submitted after the deadline would not necessarily be rejected. This shows the extent to which basic principles of due processes and fair play have been ignored in the rush to have an international investigation into Sri Lanka. Notwithstanding these issues and the falsity of the allegations being made, and despite the sad irony of LTT cadres and operatives being allowed to make accusation against the military, the Geneva process could have serious repercussions. Sri Lanka's sovereignty could be gravely affected unless the government remains strong and stable. It is only if the government remains strong that it will be able to take the decisions necessary to secure the best interest of this country. Sri Lanka must strongly and consistently maintain its principled rejection of the international investigation. We must also continue to actively muster the support of friendly nations in the international community. In this regard, it is important to bear in mind that the pressure mounted against Sri Lanka comes only from certain parts of the world. It is by no means reflective of a world opinion. As long as the government remains strong and stable, action detrimental to Sri Lanka cannot be easily carried out through international processes. Above all, the government must remain able to reject demands from various quarters that are inimical to the national interest. This is a serious issue that all Sri Lankans must take note of and be vigilant about. Peace exists in Sri Lanka today as a result of the humanitarian operation. Peace exists because His Excellency the President had the political will, the determination, and the courage to see the military campaign through to the very end. Peace exists because the armed forces carried out an extremely difficult operation through immense hardship for 3.5 years to defeat the terrorists. During this time, more than 6,000 brave soldiers gave up their lives, and 25,000 more suffered serious injury to win over our freedom from the LTTE's terror. Our peace, stability, and security, our very future, in fact, was won at immense cost. We must never forget that. And we must never allow these sacrifices to be demeaned or diminished because of international pressure or because of political convenience. In this context, it is extremely unfortunate to note that there are some influential figures within Sri Lanka who have said openly that the country should submit itself to an international investigation. One such figure has even admitted to being proud of her children for saying they were ashamed to be Sinhalese and Sri Lankans after having watched what is little more than an LTTE propaganda film aired on Channel 4. The question we must all ask ourselves at this point in time is whether we are willing to risk the future of Sri Lanka by weakening our resolve to protect what we have legitimately achieved. Can we trust those whose past actions were dictated by external pressures to do what is best for Sri Lanka in the future? The most critical thing for Sri Lanka today is the maintenance of stability. Ensuring that our present momentum does not falter requires continuity above everything else. All of the problems caused by 3 decades of terrorism and lacks of governance of past governments cannot be solved in just 4 years. The sheer range of issues is far too great to have been dealt with comprehensively in such a short span of time. In fact, in consideration of how vast these challenges were, the progress that has been achieved by the incumbent government since the end of the war is truly remarkable. Between 2006 and 2009, the government's focus was on ending terrorism and bringing peace to Sri Lanka. From 2009 to date, its focus has been on maintaining that peace, stability, and security, whilst creating an environment conducive to sustained economic growth. As we go forward, I am absolutely certain that all the remaining issues we face as a nation, including issues of national reconciliation, good governance, will be systematically addressed and solved by the government. This will contribute to the creation of a resurgent Sri Lanka that can stand proudly and independently as a peaceful, stable, fast-growing, sovereign state in the community of nations. If this is to be the case, we must not stray from the transformative path we have been on for the last several years. Instead, we must continue on the journey we have been on together. It is both our duty and our privilege to sustain our present momentum as a nation and achieve all that we can for Sri Lanka and for Sri Lankans. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. I want to thank Mr. Kishu Gomez for his excellent presentation. Distinguished invitees, organizers of the Momentum Conference, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to see so many high caliber professionals from various fields participating at this event, which is centered on Sri Lanka's present momentum and its vibrant future prospects. After 3 decades of stagnation caused by the terrorist conflict, this country has made amazing progress in all areas during the past 5 years of peace. Sri Lanka's potential for rapid economic growth in the years to come is immense. I have great confidence that the future of this country will be a very bright and prosperous one if we sustain our current momentum. Safeguarding our hard-won peace, security, and sovereignty is the most important requirement for us to ensure that Sri Lanka will continue to make rapid progress in all areas. Over the last 5 years, the government has taken every effort to enable the full benefits of peace to reach the general public. However, the President, the security forces, and the intelligence agencies have remained constantly vigilant about the very real threats of terrorism, separatism, and unwarranted interference in our internal affairs that our nation faces even today. As we all know, the primary obstacle to Sri Lanka's progress in the past was the terrorist conflict that lasted 3 decades. At the time, His Excellency the President Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected to office in 2005. All 4 past presidents had tried to solve this problem without any success. From the 1980s onwards, successive governments had attempted peace talks, military campaigns, and even tried international mediation with peacekeeping forces and monitoring missions as a way to end the terrorist conflict. All of these attempts failed. The public began to lose confidence in the government's ability to neutralize the terrorism. Many experts within and outside Sri Lanka maintained that the LTT could not be defeated militarily and therefore needed to be somehow accommodated. Instead of becoming weaker, the LTT grew stronger and stronger. Over time, it became firmly entrenched in the north and east of Sri Lanka. By 2005, under an ineffective ceasefire agreement signed 4 years before by the previous government, the LTT was effectively in control of a separate state. The army maintained a forward defense line in the north of Sri Lanka, which stretched from west coast to east coast, from Mannar to Valioya, Mannar, Vaunia, and Valioya. 10 or 20 yards in front of that, the LTT had its own bunker line, own forward defensive line. The army had another forward defense line north of Elephant Pass at famous Muhammali. 10 yards or 20 yards below, the LTT maintained its own defense line. This type of forward defense lines, you call FDLs, of this nature are normally found only at the borders of two warring countries. But in 2005, within Sri Lanka, they represented the borders of a vast area of land outside the government's control. Neither the Sri Lankan police nor the military could enter this region, which was controlled by the LTT. Some non-governmental organizations and a few business people visited these areas, but they first had to take permission from the army at the Omante checkpoint. Then they had to walk 10 yards and stop at the LTT's checkpoint to fill a form, pay a fee, and undergo screening. It was quite similar to being at the border of a different country. Within this territory, the LTT had its own police force, its own court system, its own bank, and it directed the decisions of the civil administration. The rest of Sri Lanka was also under its threat and paralyzed by fear. Those living in areas close to LTT controlled land, those days known as border villages, lived in constant fear of armed attacks. People in the rest of the country never knew when a terrorist bombing would end their lives or kill their loved ones. Irrespective of social or economic status, all Sri Lankans suffered from a fear psychosis that affected every aspect of their life. Parents avoided traveling together for fear of leaving their children orphan. Schools were operated like prisons, with barricades against entry, a high security presence, and constant checks on bags and persons. There were checkpoints on all major roads, and spot checks were carried out on vehicles very frequently. Cordon and search operations took place from time to time in residential areas. Barricades made of railway girders and concertina wire obstructed access to state buildings. High walls hide buildings from view. There was no sense of freedom in public places. Constant vigilance about possible threats and constant suspicion of other was the norm. LTT attacks were indiscriminate and not even places of worships were spared. You will no doubt still remember the brutal attacks that took place at the Temple of the Tooth Relic, the Sri Mahabodhiya, and also the Katankudi Mosque. No doubt you still remember the 250 kg truck bomb that killed more than 100 in the attack on the Central Bank complex. No doubt you still remember the attack on the Colonnava oil refinery and the attack on the international airport that destroyed nearly 22 aircrafts. Everyone lived in fear. Those in the Tamil community suffered even more than the most. They not only feared terrorist attacks, but also feared a communal backlash whenever an LTT attack took place. Terrorism had many other repercussions on Sri Lanka, far beyond the fear it spread everywhere. Our economic progress slowed down significantly. Because of the war, the government could not develop public infrastructure or improve the quality of utilities and services. Both foreign and domestic private investments declined drastically, as companies had no confidence to invest in this uncertain environment. With the country being in the news for all the wrong reasons, tourist arrivals slowed down to a trickle. Hoping to find better prospects and safer living environment abroad, thousands of outstanding young people left Sri Lanka, reducing the capacity of our workforce and further affecting the economy. The very social fabric was under threat. Political leaders, state officials, and other public figures were assassinated ruthlessly. Not only this deprived the country of several high-caliber leaders, but many capable young people stayed out of public life due to fear of the LTT threat. Significantly, the LTT also eliminated moderate Tamil leaders who did not support the creation of a separate state for Tamil Eelam. Emergency regulations were continuously enforced, with individual rights and freedoms curtailed in favor of public security. With the increase in terrorist activity and the armed response to it by the state, firearms and ammunition started to flow to criminal elements, aiding the rise of the so-called underworld. Can you remember the characters such as, very famous Vele Sudha, Tel Bala, Gonavala Sunil, Baddegane Sanjeeva, Navala Nihal, Ice Manju, and so many others who operated in the country during that period, creating a mess of law and order. The priority of the police and law enforcement agencies was mainly to prevent terrorism. Training for new recruits to the police was drastically reduced from, I think, nearly for 1 year to just at the latter stages to 2 months. And after basic weapon training, these recruits were deployed to prevent terrorist activities. They were given the T-56 machine guns and put to the bunkers, to checkpoints. As a result, normal law enforcement activities suffered immensely during this time. Strong institutions and good governance were far-fetched dreams at that time. The ramification of terrorism affected every aspect of our lives. That bleak era, which lasted nearly 30 long years, finally came to an end as a result of the humanitarian operation. that took place between July 2006 and May 2009. Ending the terrorist conflict once and for all had been the primary task entrusted to His Excellency the President Mahinda Rajapaksa by the people of Sri Lanka in his first term. Through sheer determination and unwavering commitment, he delivered on his promise just 3.5 years after being elected in November 2005. There is no doubt that the defeat of the LTTE and the dawn of peace in May 2009 was the pivotal event in Sri Lanka's recent history. During the President's second term in office, the task entrusted to him by the people was to achieve economic development. In setting about this task, he also had to address a number of post-conflict challenges: demining and resettling those displaced by the LTTE during the last stages of the conflict, and rebuilding areas that had stagnated under LTTE dominance for decades was essential. Roads, railways, irrigation canals, electricity transmission, as well as housing and other facilities had to be reconstructed and improved. Rehabilitating LTTE cadres who had surrendered or been captured was another challenge. Despite their having carried arms against the state, the President was very keen to give the LTTE cadres an opportunity for a better life. He insisted on a swift rehabilitation process which has been quite successful. Then disarming the various other armed groups which had helped the military over the years was a difficult task. But it was done soon after the war ended in order to help to strengthen the democracy. Repealing restrictions on movements on both land and sea, reviving democratic processes and re-establishing elections in the north and east were also critical to the restoring normalcy in the former LTTE controlled areas. In addition, the long-standing emergency regulations had to be repealed and normalcy restored to the country at large. Further steps also had to be taken to expedite the process of national reconciliation. As a result of the concerted efforts by the government since 2009, each of these post-conflict challenges has been systematically overcome. Much work has also been done to ensure the creation of a macroeconomic environment conducive for development. Critical public infrastructure, including power generation and transmission facilities, roads, railways, ports, and airports, has been built to create a new growth opportunities and spur foreign and local investment. Urban development has been greatly accelerated to create a better environment and enable a high standard of living for the general public. All of this was despite immense challenges in the other spheres, including foreign affairs, that the government had to contend with during the past 5 years. Because of all this hard work undertaken by the government during this time, however, Sri Lanka has recovered from the ravages of the conflict in record time. Notwithstanding all of these facts, it is critical to realize that our present peace and stability is not simply due to our having defeated the LTT and its terrorism in May 2009. There are still many threats that beset our nation, and attempts continue to be made by various parties to undermine Sri Lanka's peace, security, and stability, and especially the sovereignty. The foremost duty of the government is to ensure that such threats are contained and eventually eliminated. Unless the security of the nation and its people is ensured, no true progress is possible. The many steps taken to secure the nation against the threats it faces is another aspect of the hard work carried out by the government since 2009. Despite the death of Prabhakaran and the defeat of LTT's military organization, the primary threat to our national security remains the re-emergence of terrorism. From the 1980s onwards, a lot of support was generated internationally for the LTT and its Elam enterprise. The LTT's vast international network and extremists within the expatriate Tamil population remain committed to the separatist cause even to this day. Groups such as the Tamil Coordinating Committee, led by a person called Nidhiyavan, ex-LTT cadre, the Transnational Government of Tamil Elam, led by Rudrakumaran, the Global Tamil Forum, led by the so-called Father Emmanuel, and the LTT, another group called LTT Headquarter Group, led by another LTT, ex-LTT cadre, Vinayagam, remain largely intact and extremely active in different various foreign countries. They have control over the vast financial resources, and they continue to use these funds for the separatist cause. Their ultimate aim is to split Sri Lanka apart and carve out a separate state, and they will use all possible mechanisms they can to achieve their objective. Foiling the efforts of these groups has required and continues to require a great deal of effort by the government. Strengthening our intelligence services has been one of these main efforts. Over the past 5 years, the State Intelligence Service and the intelligence wings of the